from a mixed religious household. My mother's side of the family are devout Irish Catholics, and my dad's side of the family are devout Latter-day Saints. Ultimately, my parents chose to be spiritual and leave the religion to my wonderful grandmothers. Whichever grandmother showed up on Sunday morning first determined where my brother and I would go to church. So, like any normal middle schoolers, I joined a Pentecostal worship band in 8th grade and stayed there until my freshman year of college, when I fell in love with Eucharist and loud organ music and returned to the Catholic Church. Years later, I came out as a gay man to a priest, Father Peoples. I expected some kind of qualified compassion in his response, but there was no but or if in his reply. He said, "Michael, it sounds like you have an incredible capacity to love, so you should do that." For the past 10 years, I've been fed and challenged and wonderfully embraced in the Episcopal Church. My partner and I will be married by 2 Episcopal priests next summer, 1 lesbian, 1 straight. Hindsight's 2020, and looking back, I can see myself so desperately wanting to escape or bury who I really was and am. I tell you all of this because I want you to know that I see you, and though I cannot know your pain specifically, I know what it's like to crush on a guy and instantly become overcome with shame. I know what it's like to harbor a secret so big that it results in double consciousness, a self that says you're sinful, you're a disgrace. Even though faith is part of the reason I felt that way all those years ago, it's also the reason I'm here today, and it's the reason I can do the work that I do. My faith and my sexuality coexist, and they give me a perspective as a scientist that I consider an asset. Psalm 139, a favorite of mine, says this: "For you yourself created my inmost parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I will thank you because I am marvelously made. Your works are wonderful, and I know it well." I have a very complicated, nuanced message today. I'm speaking in generalities, the results of aggregate data. And that might mean that your experience, the experience of someone you know, or someone you lost to suicide, may sound different than what I'm talking about today. That does not mean your experience, or the experience of someone close to you, is invalid. You do not need data to validate your experience. Neither does your experience invalidate these data. When we speak of suicide, we're really talking about 3 different groups of people. People who think about suicide, or ideators, people who attempt suicide, and people who die by suicide. In the US, about 4.3% of the general population seriously thought about suicide at some point in the previous year. There are about 25 non-fatal suicide attempts for every 1 suicide death. What's important here is that people who seriously think about suicide, people who attempt suicide, and people who die by suicide are different groups of people with some overlap. When you look at attempters and individuals who have died by suicide, these differences come into focus. About 3 females attempt suicide for every 1 male, but the opposite is true for suicide death. 1 female dies for every 3 males. When you examine most of the research on suicide carefully, you'll notice that individuals in these studies are people who thought about or who attempted suicide, but who did not die by suicide. The reason for this disparity in research may be obvious. People who have died by suicide cannot answer surveys or tell their stories. Consequently, learning these stories, which I believe to be critically important, requires unique, intensive, and prolonged research methodologies, most of which exceed grant cycles. In Utah, I'm happy to say, we're doing this kind of research. So I want to narrow our conversation to sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, and suicide. Like I said, this is a complicated topic. Sexual orientation and gender identity are 2 broad, related, fluid, and intertwined categories. Let's talk about attempts. Most of what we know about LGBTQ+ suicide comes almost entirely from those who think about or who attempt suicide, not from those who die by suicide. It has been very well established that LGBTQ+ people think about and attempt suicide at much higher rates than their heterosexual peers. These findings come from reputable population-based research. Specifically, here are some examples. LGBT high schoolers attempt suicide at a rate 2 to 7 times that of their peers. By gender, sexual orientation was a stronger predictor of suicide attempt for young men than young women. That's especially interesting because we know the opposite to be true in the general population, that women attempt suicide more often than men. In a New Zealand cohort study, individuals who identified as LGB at age 21 were 6 times more likely to attempt suicide than their heterosexual peers. Those odds increased when the cohort was interviewed again at age 25. A study of urban gay men in the US found that 12% of the sample had attempted suicide ever in their life. That's 3 times the rate of males in the general US population. Transgender and gender nonconforming individuals are not surprisingly at higher risk of suicide ideation and attempts as well, although the research on gender identity is severely lacking, even compared to research on sexual orientation. A few older studies estimate that between 19 and 25% of trans folk have attempted suicide. A recent American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and Williams Institute study, which used a convenient sample of 6,456 self-identified trans and gender nonconforming individuals, found that 46% of trans women and 42% of trans men had attempted suicide. Among those who reported suffering physical or sexual violence at school or work, or those who were victimized or discriminated against by law enforcement or their health care providers, those numbers soared to as high as 70%. Generally speaking, suicidologists, that is a real word, have regarded religion, and especially religious participation, as a protective factor to suicide attempts. Religion promotes connection, and so this makes sense. But as my colleague pointed out earlier, religion is not so cleanly a protective factor, and maybe not a protective factor at all for people who fear rejection or who are rejected by their congregations and religious leaders. A study of 21,247 college students showed that those students who identified as LGBTQ were at a high risk of suicide ideation in the past year and of having attempted suicide ever in their lifetime if they reported that religion was very important to them. Suicide ideation and attempt were only a factor when religion was ranked as very important. In other words, identifying as Catholic, evangelical, Presbyterian, Latter-day Saint, Muslim, or what have you is not what predicted suicide in this study. Rather, the importance of that identity as a religious person. We know very little about suicide death among sexual and gender minorities. If you do not remember anything else I say here today, please sticky note this statement. We don't know the rates of LGBTQ suicide death. Here's what we do know. 3 psychological autopsy studies, which occurred in 1986, 1995, and 2010 respectively, each concluded that sexual minorities were not overrepresented in their samples. These findings are not generalizable to the population at large, though, and they have significant limitations. A study of demographic components in Danish vital records showed that men who were in domestic partnerships with other men were 8 times more likely to die by suicide than men who were in heterosexual marriages, and twice as likely as men who had never been married. Women in domestic partnerships with other women showed no increase in suicide death compared to women who are in heterosexual marriages. This study, again, though, is limited because it only included LGBT people who are currently or formerly in legally registered domestic partnerships. There are even fewer studies of trans and gender nonconforming people and suicide death. One longitudinal cohort study of 1,000 people documented the suicide death of exactly 12 trans-identified persons, which, expressed in terms of rate, is 800 per 100,000. Consider that the current rate of suicide in the US is 14 per 100,000. That rate is deeply unsettling. But here again, this is another study that cannot be generalized. And despite a dearth of research on trans people and suicidality, I think we have plenty of evidence to claim that trans and gender nonconforming people and their community are affected by suicide at alarmingly high levels. We need more research, but we shouldn't wait around for that research to be published before we act. The National Violent Death Reporting System, or NVDRS, is the only system that includes all suicide deaths in the U.S. NVDRS includes several variables that attempt to measure sexual orientation and gender identity. The problem, at least until recently, has been that sexual orientation and gender identity have not been a routine part of death investigation. So most of the time, sexual orientation and gender identity components are left unknown in NVDRS. Just this past year, one of the first journal articles on sexual orientation and gender identity was released using data from NVDRS. Researchers reported that of the 123,289 suicide deaths that occurred between 2003 and 2014, 621, or 0.5%, identified as LGBTQ. Frankly, I was surprised this study was even published. A careful read of the same study will reveal that sexual orientation and/or gender identity for 119,394 individuals were unknown and therefore referred to as not LGBT. You don't need a PhD to conclude that when 98% of the data is missing, your study is pretty bad. Those findings are problematic. In a Utah-specific study of of 40 decedents was determined out of the total 107. Of the 40, 6, or 15%, were identified as LGBTQ. If the estimate of LGBTQ people in the general population is between 7 and 10%, then that means that LGBTQ people are at a significantly higher risk of suicide death than their peers. However, the sexual orientation for 73% of young people in that same study could not be determined. So drawing empirical conclusions from this study is also quite shaky. So you see, things are quite complicated. And really, they boil down to the fact that if we want answers about sexual orientation and gender identity among those who die by suicide, we have to ask about sexual orientation and gender identity. Utah is currently the only statewide death investigation system that is asking these questions for every person who dies by suicide. We started this about 10 months ago, so we're really not ready to release findings yet. But I'm very proud that we're leading the nation on this issue. Other states and the CDC are looking to Utah as a model for conducting public investigations in other medical legal death jurisdictions. We're leaning into these answers. This is not an easy, fast process, but we're pushing the limits as we have not done before. I take heart in knowing that in the not too distant future, we'll have better information so we can inform and target our prevention efforts more effectively, because we deserve answers. Earlier, I mentioned that what I share with you today does not invalidate your experience. I know that many of you have lost someone you loved beyond measure to suicide. I'm so sorry. I really wish their story and your story were different. I want you to know that you're not alone, and that what I'm about to say still does not invalidate your experience. I got a frantic phone call from a colleague during General Conference weekend of spring 2018. He told me 5 young Latter-day Saints had taken their lives. 5 youth deaths this chronologically close together is extremely alarming, no matter the circumstances. Yet in reality, there were no deaths of anyone under the age of 35. No homicides, no accidents, no natural deaths, undetermined deaths, or suicide deaths. Meanwhile, on Facebook, this story was picking up steam. Fortunately, someone intervened, and that's something I legally cannot do, and ask for names or some kind of proof of these deaths. That proof could be produced because no such deaths had occurred, at least not here in Utah. This post, this story, they made me angry because false reports are damaging lies. I often ask audiences what proportion of all suicide deaths in Utah are individuals who are between the age of 10 and 17. I hear 30, 40, 60% frequently. The real number is 6%. I'm not in the business of measuring tragedy, and I know the deaths of 10 to 17-year-olds have effects that ripple through families, churches, schools, and communities. Reading stories about teen suicide in Utah, I can understand why some might think that this number is so high. The largest demographic of Utahns, however, who die by suicide are between the ages of 25 and 45 and are white men. This example illustrates that what seems to be true and what is actually true may be different from one another. There's so much fear when we talk about suicide, especially suicide among LGBTQ people and youth. Fear often motivates us to move in the wrong direction. Sexual and gender minority status may be a significant factor in explaining Utah's high suicide rate, or it may not. We cannot afford, though, to get this wrong. I can tell you that the pain of a mother who lost her straight son to suicide is a lot like the suffering of a mother who lost her lesbian daughter. Ending suicide is the goal here, and both of these mothers deserve to know and believe that that is our central mission. Anna Madrigal, the trans woman matriarch in Armistead Maupin's Tales of the City series, says it best: there is only the truth. We have enough information now to do something. Get training, reduce access to lethal means, work to establish GSAs in the schools in your community, inform your church leadership on things they can do to protect queer people in and out of their congregations. It's right that we harness our experiences in ways that motivate us to take action. Lives are at stake. It's also right to keep our minds open to whatever we may learn about suicide moving forward. As I wrap up, I want to emphasize 2 points. It's critical that we continue to engage in this conversation and make others aware that discrimination at all levels may have life and death consequences, especially for our LGBTQ siblings. It's also critical that our message be hopeful, maybe even inspirational. When we say that LGBTQ kids are killing themselves left and right because of rejection from family or church or whatever the case may be, we're inadvertently normalizing that behavior. We're normalizing suicide. In other words, an LGBTQ person, especially a young LGBTQ person, may recognize that the problems and adversities they face are similar to some other person who died by suicide. For that person, suicide now becomes a feasible, realistic option. Keeping the message hopeful tells LGBTQ people and anyone else struggling with suicidal thoughts that living is a better option, that it gets better. Here's something that gives me a great deal of hope. Ask me to give you a list of people I know who identify as LGBTQ and who are alive, even happy and well. And then ask me for names of the people I know who are LGBTQ and who have died by suicide, and I'm absolutely confident that the first list is much longer than the latter. Queer fragility is a myth. LGBTQ people face challenges and adversities that their peers do not. And even in the face of this adversity, queer folks are so damn strong. I hope it's okay, I swore. It's important that all of the stories be told, the good and the bad. But let's make sure that our stories of hope are the stories that are heard the most. People who are struggling need to hear them, and they need to hear them often, because I'm confident that hope is going to carry the day. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. I don't know if you can tell from the bio, but working in the Utah State Medical Examiner's office means that he works with death. And as a hopefully sometimes a smart person, I might not have gotten that and known that, but that's what he does. And the idea that his message is so much about hope and resilience, I'm just really delighted by that. I wanted to ask you to tell us just a little bit more about the statewide death investigation that I think you had a hand in promoting. Most of us have wondered about the kinds of things that Michael's talking about. What really is the rate of suicide for LGBTQ people in Utah? And there's been no way of knowing that until this project that Michael mentioned. And I'd love for you to tell us just a little bit more about that, how that came to be.
Yeah. This is, so I started a little over 2 years ago at the medical examiner's office, and I went to our death investigation chief, and I said, we're going to have to start asking about sexual orientation and gender identity, among a whole host of other things. And I got a pretty quick and fast no. Like, get out of my office kind of thing, almost. And I just decided, well, if you're not going to ask, then I am. So I found interns who are as passionate about this work as I am, and we've been calling families. And then we demonstrated to the chief medical examiner, who's very supportive of this work, and of the chief, we had some turnover, but chief death investigator, that families are okay with being asked these hard questions. In fact, they weren't offended. In fact, like, we can ask about this and it's okay. And so she let me give an hour-long presentation to our statewide death investigators this last spring. And I kind of wore a bulletproof vest and like a white shirt so the tomato marks would show up, because it was like, these are all like people of a certain age who are very set in their ways. And they said, you know, I've always felt like we could do so much more. And I'm so glad that you came to do this. And I left there thinking, wow, this is amazing. That this can happen in Kane County, Utah, or in Daggett County, Utah, and that the people that we're sending into the field want to be part of the solution, not just people who are, you know, continuing to do the things that they've always done just because that's what they think. So I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, we are too. How long do you think it will take before there's something reportable?
Oh boy. I'm hoping January.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
That's not
we're
very
close.
far away.
We're close. We want a year's worth of data and then be able to look over that data and make sure that what we're saying is true. Like I said, we got to get this right. We deserve answers, and so we don't want to falsely report anything. But I'm really looking forward to where this leads us.
We can tell how careful you are and excited to hear what you will bring to us.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. I also wanted to ask another question about what you said. You said that those young people who said that religion was very important to them were the ones for whom their identity was associated with suicidal ideation. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, so that study is very nuanced, and condensing it down to a paragraph was very difficult. So lesbian and gay respondents in that study who said that religion was very important, they had significantly higher risk of suicidal ideation and attempt. What was interesting is that bisexual and questioning individuals in the same study, actually it didn't matter if they said that religion was not very important, moderately important, or very important. Religion, identifying as some religion, ended up resulting in higher risk of suicide ideation. And
For which
attempt.
groups? For bisexual
For
and
bisexual
transgender?
and questioning.
And questioning.
Yeah.
So bisexual and questioning youth seem to have trouble just with religion in general.
Yeah, I think we're all kind of in an agreement with that questioning in particular is this phase of figuring things out. It's not, some people question for their whole life long. I don't want to diminish that identification, but that this is a time of what do I do next?
Mm-hmm. And that they were particularly vulnerable.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Michael Lee.
okay. We'll bring it. Here we go. Okay, sorry for that. So thank you for being here. I'm going to be presenting, on my part, a brief roadmap to trauma, and hopefully that will give us an understanding of the roadmap to healing and growing from trauma. So we know what causes trauma is minority stress or structural oppression. And basically what this involves is racism, sexism, faithism, heterosexism, homophobia, bisexual erasure, bisexual invisibility, transphobia, and trans erasure, and trans invisibility. So basically all the ways you can feel bad about yourself for being different, and the ways you can be socially disadvantaged for being different. But minority stress affects people in two different ways. It's this negating coercive messages and experiences that my colleagues have been talking about. So you feel this pressure of, that you shouldn't be this way. This can be deficiency, pathological viewpoints of who you are, about being sexually or gender diverse. But it's also a lack of affirmation, so a lack of positive options of how to be healthy of who you are. So there's oppressive environment and this lack of affirming, empowering information to support your growth. One question that I like to ask people to see if they've been affected by minority stress is, what are 3 to 5 words that you would describe being LGBTQ? So think about for your own sexual gender identity, what would be 3 to 5 words to describe you? And the way you feel about LGBTQ, that's going to affect your mental health, your self-concept, your options, how you cope with that, and your actions, and also your relationships. And then we have our parents, and our siblings, our religious leaders, our teachers, our important people in our lives growing up, who are also affected by this oppressive environment and lack of affirming options for diversity. And this is called attachment wounds. So basically, we learn to see ourselves first in the responses of our caregivers, and that's good and bad, but we learn from our caregivers what is safe and what is a threat. And the problem with that is our caregivers may have had limited restricted experiences of what is safe and a threat in terms of sexual and gender diversity. So our caregiver, just like our religion, can be a source of care, but also a source of threat. It's called a biological paradox, that the child, the body goes toward and away from the same figure, trying to attach, but also is afraid of that attachment. It's called a fear without a solution. And it creates dissociation, detachment, preoccupation, an avoidance relationship style. And the question I like to ask in terms of this would be, what were the rules of engagement growing up? So to be in a relationship with your father, what did you have to do? What was the things that you couldn't do? To be in a relationship with your mother, what did you need to do and not do? With your siblings, with your religious leader, with your heavenly father, what were the rules of engagement to be in that relationship? And then we have complex trauma. So it's very different than like a one-time abuse or one-time physical attack, but it's a prolonged developmental violation against who you are and a lack of help of who you are. And then it's this, there's no resolution to that complex trauma. The effects of trauma, your process of self-determination, so your natural birthright of who you are, that gets inhibited, postponed, hijacked, distracted, distorted, impaired. And it creates a disconnection. So you disconnect from yourself in order to be in a relationship with those you love. You disconnect from others. You may disconnect from God. It creates a self-shame, which you may turn against yourself or turn away from yourself. You may disown your feelings. You may believe you have to cut off your feelings. You may feel bad about your needs. And you may not be aware of your limits. This, of course, will create poor relationships with peers. You'll lose a community, and it may create a profound loneliness. And that loneliness is going to be associated with negative beliefs about yourself and about your future. You may lose your spiritual center, your meaning, your purpose of life. Again, your focus on what you can't do and what's wrong about you. This creates a psych ache. It's a psychological pain. This would be about when we know that rejection. Rejection hurts people. It physically hurts, emotionally hurts. And so if you're rejected by people in your life, you're likely going to reject yourself. And that lifetime of rejection by others and by yourself of you starts building up. And actually, there's research that the psychological pain is one of the predictors of suicide. You have to have better coping than this emotional hurt that you're experiencing. And it's very normal to internalize this rejection, this shame. Again, as children, we copy, we treat ourselves the way we've been treated, we take on the values of our caregivers, and we treat ourselves, we copy the self-negation, the self-neglect. Examples of this could be that we wish to be heterosexual and cisgender rather than wishing to be who you are. We may believe that being queer is a personal shortcoming. You may believe that queer relationships are inferior to heterosexual ones, and that it's best to avoid LGBTQ people. We know that negative with trauma and minority stress creates negative self-beliefs. And these involve believing that you're defective, unlovable, inferior, so you're bad, sick, and wrong. You believe that you're powerless, you're inadequate, you don't have any choices, that you're not good enough. And finally, the sense of you're unsafe. So you may feel like you're chronically unsafe, and it all adds up to that it's not okay or safe to be who you are. So that's about how to create trauma. I'll talk now about how to heal or grow from that trauma. And basically, you need corrective emotional experiences. And what that entails, really, you need safety. You need affirmation, and you need options to be yourself. But we live in this structural oppression, society of prejudice and discrimination for being different. So until those things change, you need resilience. And I like this idea that queer people are strong. We really are. That we have to develop this resilience, which means developing health in the midst of adversity. So if you can't change things outside, you're going to change how you feel about yourself. And resilience comes from individual resources, from community resources. You're going to need proactive skills, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And all this helps you develop self-awareness, self-acceptance, self-compassion, self-nurturance. So you start developing an I in the middle of this storm. And in the sense of I, the sense of liking who you are and loving yourself and confidence, then you start to meet your needs, and that helps you to thrive. And then you develop a personal positive meaning of life for you that fits you. In terms of experiencing safety, safety comes in two ways, basically. It comes from the environment makes it safe for you. So you're safe from attack, you're safe from violence, for being who you are. And the other way is you make it safe for you. And there are many ways to do that, and I'll describe that. But basically, you develop maybe a physical self-defense or a cognitive self-defense, or maybe you don't disclose who you are. But it's really important to know, are you safe now? In this room, are we safe? Are you safe for the eternities? That sense of safety allows people to either calm or get activated. It's important to navigate safety across contexts, meaning that minorities need safe spaces. That could be physical safe spaces again, or internal self spaces, so that we can recharge and get back to our truth. Two questions that I like to ask people, they take some time, so hopefully you can take this home with you, is what do you need in particular yourself from others to be safe? And the second one is, what do you need from yourself to be safe? If you take the time to really answer those questions for you, then you can maybe ask those who you're in a relationship with, you can request those safety needs. Or you can evaluate, are these safe people for me? And then you can also know, are you giving yourself what you need for this safety? Another question I think is important is, what do we need as a community to make it safer for everyone? Now those proactive skills that I was mentioning. For good or for bad, we humans, we store trauma separately from our adult brain. And what that means is when we're younger or older, whenever trauma happens, it gets stuck in our emotional memory. And when anything in the present reminds us of something from the past, we don't think about it. We automatically feel the stuff from the past. So we may feel these physical sensations, the negative thoughts may be unconscious, and it causes a reflex response. We're all born with are these reflexes of fight, flight, freeze, or collapse, or submit. Those responses are survival strategies, and they're great to get us through things, but they're not great for the long term. And that's the problem with trauma, is we're stuck in these triggers and these reenactments, and we're pulled into the past. I like describing it as a trauma vortex or a shame vortex. When unconsciously, without knowing it, we're back there again, acting like we did. And the problem with that is, again, that it may not be true in the here and now, that only a component of that trauma reminds us, but we still actually may be safe in the moment. And that's where mindfulness skills, these proactive skills, come in handy. Mindfulness skills, they activate the prefrontal cortex, our human brain. Mindfulness skills allows the person to be curious, to be open, to be compassionate. It's really basically helps you to love the moment and love yourself. So in mindfulness skills allows you to develop a non-judgmental awareness. You're able to observe what's happening, so a sense of curiosity. You have a here and now presence. You have a reality check of what's going on. It helps you to unblend from that trauma vortex. So you may feel the feelings, but you realize, you may think, I feel really bad, but I know that I'm good. So it allows you that bridge between what happened then to what's happening right now. And it allows you to connect with yourself and with the other person. So it's not just a one-way, one or the other, but there's a bridge between you and the other person. And this helps you to act rather than react, and it helps you to act with self-direction, and then you can meet your needs. Other proactive skills to improve your response to rejection, discrimination, and again, they're all about the prefrontal cortex, to develop an affirming response to rejection and discrimination. That means instead of internalizing what others are doing to you, you're able to value yourself, to value the aspects of yourselves that they can't. So there's a separateness that you like what they can't. You're able to have compassion towards yourself, maybe compassion toward those who are attacking you. It allows you to forgive them, to understand them, to accept and make decisions based upon that understanding. It allows you to separate and yield, which is very different from detach or avoid. Avoidance is good, but it doesn't allow you to have competence. But this idea of separating and yielding allows you to not personalize or internalize their limits or their actions. So you let them do them. You grant them autonomy, this freedom to be themselves. But you also focus on nurturing yourself. You go in your own direction. That's why I like the idea of a yielding intersection. You let them be them, and you go where is best for you. Another response to rejection is a non-aggressive resistance. And what that means is that you're centered in yourself and in your truth, and that allows you to reject what doesn't fit you. You refuse to accept the status quo because you're not involved in it. And all this is based upon valuing diversity and equality for everyone. You're going to have to reclaim anger. A lot of, I think, LGBTQ people, a lot of religious people are nice people. And nice people can get walked over. So I like the idea of reclaiming a compassionate anger. That allows you to recognize when you've been harmed, when your boundaries have been violated. And someone described this as a boundary protection if you have this compassionate anger. It's important to know your rights to equality, to freedom, to autonomy, to fairness, to value diversity, to do no harm to yourself or to others. When you use this compassionate anger, then you can set limits. You can say, I'm not going to put up with that for me. And that setting of limits then allows you to focus on positive changes in your life. It's very different than enmeshed anger. Enmeshed anger is anger that you're trying to control what's outside your boundaries. She should never have said that. Well, yes, she should have. She has the right to say that. And when you're doing that, you're outside your boundaries, and you're going to get very frustrated and lose control. So the idea is get back into your own boundaries and think, when she says that, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. So again, it allows you to have control of what you can control. This compassionate anger allows you to examine and reject inappropriate guilt, so false accusations that are coming at you or you may have internalized. It also allows you to analyze or see what's your responsibility and what's their responsibility. This compassion and anger allows you to push away and refuse what doesn't fit you. It's very different than aggression, which is, again, trying to control what's outside your control, or passive aggressiveness. My colleague, Paul Linden, he's an Aikido master. He's been studying this for a long time. He phrases it this way: love without power is ineffective. It's like being passive. And power without love is brutal. That's aggression. His whole idea is to help people develop the skills to be both loving and powerful. And it's compassionate power, in a sense. And then with all this, you're going to probably likely promote social justice. You're going to want those same rights of equality, autonomy, fairness, value diversity for yourself and for them, and you're going to want them that they're not harmed like you're not harmed. Other ways to counter shame, trauma, and minority stress would be to turn toward yourself with kindness, which is basically self-compassion. But as you turn towards yourself with kindness, you're going to be aware of the impact of self-hatred. I think many of us have learned to hate ourselves into being a better person. So we may have been taught to be very critical, to get down on ourselves, to be better, to do better. But that rejection of ourselves, it has an impact. So the more that you have this kindness towards yourself, you may realize, when I'm mean to myself or critical, that doesn't help me, that doesn't empower me, doesn't motivate me for the good. So being aware of that self-hatred is setting limits on that. And that, of course, with this kindness allows for empathy for the self. I like this quote: a wound needs a witness. So all the times, the ways that you were traumatized or hurt, if you're able to witness that for yourself and others witness that, then something's healing is going to happen there. And one thing would be that you develop awareness of your boundaries. You realize that that is not okay for me, and realize what is okay for you. You should start realizing and valuing your own uniqueness, and therefore your own needs. It's important to feel equal and proud. And then all these, this positive reaction to yourself, it's going to counter those negative self-beliefs that I was mentioning, that you're different and you deserve good treatment. This will help you to live positively as a minority. Other ways to counter shame would be to explore a wide range of options from different sources. And that will help you to develop a sexual self-knowledge that fits you, your own gender self-knowledge. And this will help you to have a personal and social congruence in the ways that promote well-being for you and that are authentic to you in particular and that are available to you. And all this is going to give you this information of to make decisions about which relationships, which life options fit best for you. And this will lead you to find places to belong where you can do yourself. This will counter those beliefs that you're unsafe, because you're not alone, you're valuable. Meeting needs for connection, intimacy, and mutual understanding will be most important for your health. Taking your place within your family, within your community, within your relationships, where you're part of the equation. This will help you to integrate who you are so you're not so fragmented. And then in the places that you belong, where they're affirming you, you can use the collective wisdom and their strengths for your own growth. And I like this idea of evaluating if people are red, yellow, or green light people. Red light people, if you go full speed ahead in a red light, you're going to get hit. Red light people are critical, they turn against you, they're trying to control you, or they have power, they want to have power over you. So if you go full speed ahead, there's going to be problems there. Yellow light people, you should have caution, but green light people, you can be yourself and you feel good about yourself. There's this mutuality. Some people are red lights for some topics, they're green lights for other topics, so you may not want to throw everyone away. But you also may want to think for yourself, are you a green light for yourself? And finally, to reclaim your own spirituality, or at least your purpose of life. It was mentioned before, this positive religious coping. We know that positive religious coping weakens the harmful effects of internalized heterosexism on well-being. Examples of positive religious coping would be having a spiritual connectedness with oneself and others. So you feel like you're one with everyone. Another example of positive religious coping is developing a secure relationship or attachment with God or the universe. And this can mean that you turn to God or the universe for spiritual support. And you trust that God or the universe is going to turn to you with this love, with this acceptance, with inspiration, or wanting the best for you. Developing a quest orientation is helpful. It's very similar to that prefrontal cortex. A quest orientation is you're open, you're curious, you have compassion. It gives you the ability to tolerate ambiguities, uncertainties, and so you're more interested in the questions of life and the bigness and the awe and the mysteries of life. And all this will allow you to explore what is true for you, what is no longer true for you, and what you're currently questioning. And that's what I got. Thanks.
Thank you, Lee. I feel like we need a workshop with those things that he shared with us. I've known you long enough, Lee, to know that this is not just talk for you. These are things that you practice. I have seen you in difficult conversations with people who, as you talk about, have limits or who may find themselves not able to absorb what you are saying. And I have seen you actually use the process of saying, what do you need to be safe? Can you give us an example of a time when you said that and what you said and what the other person said, or something that's typical? How does that work? And when do you do that in a conversation?
Well, I think it's important to do it at the very beginning. But if you can't do it, establish these safety guidelines at the beginning, then when conflict is getting strong, it's a way to put the brakes on. To say, whoa, okay, something's going on here, let's back up. And it allows you to have compassion for the other person and curiosity for them, and to let them and let yourself know what's going on. So it creates a pause, a break. Some things that I think are important are like transparency, respect, compassion, respecting diversity. Some people, people that they've been known as my enemies, and when I've dialogued with them, they've wanted me to be open to their process. So I'm not going to jump and criticize them. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's rather than debating the right and wrong and trying to beat or defeat the other person, it's this hope of goodwill that we're going to find some way through this. So maybe patience would be one thing, or looking for a win-win solution where we're all going to win here.
So when a conversation starts to get tight and tense, it's a way of pausing. It can be, if you haven't done it at the beginning. I mean, I know these principles, but I usually get into the conversation first and it's tense before I recognize, oh, wait a minute. So you're suggesting that perhaps at that moment there could be a pause, and I could say, I recognize that you may not be feeling safe here. I'm starting to not feel very safe here. I'm wondering if you could take a minute and tell me what you need in this situation in order to feel like you want to interact with me, and I'll share the same thing, and that would actually let them know I'm not just all about me. Mm-hmm. And then, go ahead.
But again, that trauma or shame vortex, I think it's important to know when you're feeling that fight or flight or collapse or whatever you're going to attack, or maybe passive aggressiveness, to know what it feels in the body, because that reflex creates this oppositional thinking. So again, this right or wrong, or I'm bad, or you're bad, and I got to prove myself. So when you're aware of yourself and maybe the heat that's going on internally, or what's going on with them, I love the question or the statement you have, to observe, I see that you're upset, or I see that I'm upset. Let's slow this down. So those observations, again, it activates the prefrontal cortex of curiosity or observing, or the state of, I care enough about you and about me, I want this to go well.
Beautiful. I like how you've talked about the prefrontal cortex and how its involvement in mindfulness, because becoming aware of the process of what's going on between us and other people is a mindful process. Can you give us an example of maybe a kind of affirmation that would be helpful to us when we're feeling shame?
Shame. Well, I think shame, it's hard to know when you're feeling shame. We all, I think, know the word,
But when we're feeling it, we may not go, oh, I'm feeling shame.
Right.
It might be I feel crummy, I feel bad, I feel wrong.
Or I just want to go away.
I want to go away, I'm shrinking. So if you know, I think if you figure out for yourself when you're feeling not good enough, and then that reaction, it's a smallifying effect in the body or in the mind. If you know what's going on internally, and you can step back, this is probably better to do rather than the heat of the moment, but strike when the iron's cold, in a sense, to know what the belief is, like I'm bad. And if you know if that's what's going on inside, then you can figure out, well, what's the positive belief I would like to have about myself during that interaction? I'm good, or I'm okay, or I'm valuable, I'm lovable. And once you're able to distinguish what the negative self-belief is, then you can make that bridge to, no, I really am good. And so that affirmation, I think, is very personal for the trauma that the person experienced.
And do those kinds of affirmations that we say to ourselves actually have an effect on the brain, on the heart, on the body?
That's difficult because you're creating this affirmation here, and you're feeling it here. You can say these affirmations, and it gives you an anchor, or it allows you to center, but it may not necessarily take away what's back there. And I think that requires a more personal work where you're turning that kindness towards yourself. And so that you're treating yourself like there's a part of me that is suffering. What can I do for that part of me?
So the feeling makes a difference to the feeling part of us.
Yes, and so it's rather than trying to get rid of or overcome that sense of shame, it's really turning a kindness toward that sense of shame, and that shame needs some help. And so I think it's a mistake, again, when we're trying to ignore or get rid of shame. Shame needs a loving response. And that process of loving yourself or recognizing why I feel shame then helps that part of you feel better.
Lovely. Thank you. I'm going to review some of these questions that have come in, and while I do, I'm wondering, Michael, if you will tell us some of the suicide prevention programs or trainings that are available here in Utah that people can pursue if they're interested. And I'll look at these questions while you do that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the Suicide Lifeline prevention number, if you don't have it, put it in your phone because people in crisis don't remember numbers. So 800-273-TALK, 800-273-TALK, or if you don't like to talk to people, you can text 741, send a text to 741-741. Basically anything you send to that number, you're going to get a response. There's also the Safe UT app here in Utah. It's specifically designed for people who are in school or college, but I'll keep it a secret. If you're not in school or college and you just say that Michael Staley gave you that app, and no one, if you're getting help, no one is going to say, are you in school or college? Sorry, you're in a crisis. You'll have to go somewhere else. Also, some trainings that I want to point out. There's QPR. That's probably the most gatekeeper training in suicide prevention. QPR stands for Question, Persuade, Refer. The Utah Suicide Prevention Coalition website, it's utahsuicideprevention.org, and that website is getting up a new face very soon. We'll give you some ideas about where those QPR trainings are held. Our esteemed colleague, Deborah Coe, who probably many of you know. Is Deborah here today? I don't think so. She will come to your ward. She will come to your place of business. Deborah will go anywhere and spread the message of QPR far and wide. There's youth mental health first aid. There's mental health first aid. Those are more intensive trainings. There's Assist. That's an 8-hour-long training that goes even further with not just how to detect suicide, but what to do when you do hear about it. Because no one who is feeling or having suicidal thoughts wants to hear, if I'm going to tell Dr. Beckstead I'm feeling suicidal, no one wants Dr. Beckstead to be like, one moment, please, while I go dial 911. They want to hear, thank you for telling me that. I'm here with you now. I love you, and I'm going to be here with you no matter what. And we're going to get help because there is help. And Assist can go way more in depth than just that very surface level affirmation. So those are the ones that I can think of right off the top of my head. There are so many. There's the Utah Suicide Prevention Coalition LGBTQ subgroup as well, and that group is really getting some wheels underneath themselves, so as we speak. And I think you're going to see some more LGBTQ specific suicide prevention trainings coming out in the next year.
Thank you. I'm going to start with this question, and all of you can speak to it, but maybe we'll start with Brian. I think it's going toward religious trauma. I see religious queer people reporting negating coercive messaging and no affirmation or disaffirmation from the queer community about being religious. We're told that being involved in the church is inherently unhealthy. Shouldn't we talk about this? How can you be healthy as a religious queer or genderqueer person?
So again, part of the secondary, part of the data that I analyzed after the dissertation was published was looking at that religious-based coping. And I think that it does speak to that there are elements of benefit to be found, maybe not specifically about the teachings of sexual and gender identity, but going back to what Dr. Beck said was saying, that sense of identity, that sense of connection, those things I think keep people around. And I'm a strong advocate that everyone has to choose their own path. And I think honestly what it comes down to is a lot of times you just have to weigh the pros and cons. I think that what my study found is that there are people who are both traumatized and benefited. And it's up to that individual to decide when perhaps that trauma is too much or when they need to seek other resources to help them to overcome those traumatic messages and to focus more on those positive messages that they're getting from the church. But again, I'm a neutral bias. I try to be neutrally biased and not to speak to anyone of what they should or could do, but essentially to say that everyone has to choose their own adventure.
Do either of the two of you want to speak to that as well?
Well, I really do think it's, I think if we said religion bad, that's not going to make people leave religion. I mean, it sounds like it's another way to cause trauma, that you're negating, you're being violent against someone who, someone's belief or what feels really true for them. So I think it's important to have this, I like this idea of personal social congruence. And that is going to be so diversified, so different for every single person. And that's going to be different when you're 21, when you're 51 maybe, when you're later or whatever. So I think if you really, again, focus on the goodness, the good things about religion, about love, forgiveness, service, and then examine the human errors of religion, this idea of being critical or judgmental. I mean, we've been commanded not to judge. I think that's an important thing to recognize. Don't judge yourself or don't judge others. And I think also healing your image of God, to really have the sense that God or the universe is benevolent, that is kind and wants the best for you and wants you to be the best person you are. That sense of connection, it's going to buffer whatever someone's saying against you, and you're going to be able to say, I know myself and they don't know me. So I think it's just so diverse that you can't say one's bad and what's good and what's bad.
Yes. Rollo May, the psychologist, came to BYU and gave a devotional way back when I was a student there. And one thing he said that has resonated with me along the lines of what you're saying is that there's always a God beyond the God you understand now that maybe feels differently about events or circumstances or thoughts about your life than the God you believed in last week. That's always stayed with me. I want to remind you that if you want these amazing slides that you've seen here, they will be part of the YouTube video of this particular session that you will be able to find a link to, I think, at the Mormons Building Bridges site. So you don't have to worry about how can I get these things again. Isn't that true, Kendall? Yes, okay. All right, one other question here for Michael. If you say that talking about how the LGBTQ community is dying left and right from suicide is normalizing suicide, how do you recommend we go about bringing appropriate recognition to the real problems that are happening and the stressors? Is this not similar to saying we shouldn't talk about LGBTQ problems in general since it normalizes the problems? How can we talk about the community's problems and appropriately?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I recognize that I gave you a hard task without many ways to do that, and I apologize in my talk. I think that sometimes we emphasize suicide as a means of emphasizing how much we need help or how bad things might be. And we can talk about a gamut of experiences, from the very good to the, resilient stories, places where people went through some dark times and are now doing much better. And then it's also right that we tell the stories of people who we lost. I think that what I'm saying here is that we have to make sure, oftentimes we hear that just the last story. The normal religion and self-identity and sexuality and gender.
As the inevitable.
Right. And that's the thing that we have to make sure that we're always balancing, that if we tell the stories where we lost somebody, then we have to also make sure that we couple those with the stories of people who maybe were suicidal at one point, or who even attempted and survived, and that they recovered, and that getting treatment works. The show 13 Reasons Why, I think, kind of can parallel this question a little bit, and why do the suicide prevention community have such a difficult time with that show. It's because when the main character, Hannah Baker, went to her school counselor and said that she was having all of these problems in school, and not even specifically maybe suicide, but he said basically there's no help for you. And that's not true. That's not the message that we want to send to youth or anybody, because there is help. There is hope.
Suicide is preventable. It's one of the most preventable maladies we have. In closing, I want to read the words of Adrienne Rich, who says in one of her poems, "I came to explore the wreck. The words are purposes. The words are maps. I came to see the damage that was done and the treasures that prevail." Thank you so much.
Again, we want to thank the panelists and Lisa for the amazing presentations and conversation. On a personal note, really, really fast, I feel like I just have to bear witness that what they said is true. Specifically, I actually had an opportunity to be in a meeting with Brian when he presented his data to representatives from the LDS Church Public Affairs Office. And I knew the general sketch of his data and what it was about, where it was going, but there was a part of his presentation I don't think you were able to show today, where he went into detail describing the diagnostic process for understanding if somebody has experienced trauma and PTSD. And I had never seen such specificity on a screen in front of me. And this is in a room in, church office, or Joseph Smith building, and lots of us in suits and ties and some dresses, and anyways, kind of formal, right? And as he was going through and describing it, my brain was focused on how's the meeting going, who's listening, how receptive, managing the way I wish I could turn my brain off. But then all of a sudden, my heart started racing, and then all of a sudden I felt like burning, just genuine burning throughout my chest, my arms, and sweat. And then I thought, okay, I think I'm gonna vomit. And then I thought, what is happening? Like, do I have the flu, like instantaneous flu? And then I just felt compelled. I just literally stopped him and I said, I'm so sorry to say this, but I think I'm gonna either vomit or I have to acknowledge what I'm experiencing. And I said, I don't know if you're triggering something in me. And then out the side of my eye, a fellow queer Mormon who was in the room said, thank you for saying that, because I'm experiencing the exact same thing. And it was not rehearsed. That was not a show to sort of drive it home. It was genuine, and I have to say that, frankly, sitting here again today, thank you for triggering that all again, and you too. just to bear witness that, everything you've described, I have at least have experienced. Okay, so we're going to take a brief break, and then we will come back at 3:45, and we're going to hear from some amazing legal scholars in our final session talking about the case for queer inclusion as a function of defending religious liberty. Thank you.
I think it was like developed on a PC. I'll make sure to give you a correct version. I might not have the time to do it, but somebody else.
Yeah, and this conversation about
I'll turn it over to you. Okay, I want to invite everyone to take their seats. Just give everybody one more minute. I know there's people outside. Ah, that's good to know. I know there was a line for snacks across the hall. Okay. We'll let people trickle in as we go. For our final session together, we're going to hear from a prestigious group of adjudicators and litigators and legal scholars to discuss sort of a question that we wanted to put to them. The question, in a sense, was intended to sort of flip the script of how some people, maybe a lot of people, maybe everybody, thinks about LGBT rights and religious liberty rights, that they're in constant, eternal, perpetual opposition, and never the twain shall meet, essentially. And we wanted to say, well, what if, in some universe, it were possible for the rights of LGBTQ people to be pursued as a function of pursuing and defending religious liberty rights? We knew that had lots of potential problems, maybe even impossible, but we wanted to start from that question. So I'm going to give a little introduction, and then I will turn the time over to Ben, who will be our moderator for the session. And again, I want to remind you to refer to your programs, to find the biographical sketches on our panelists, and then also, as they're speaking throughout their session, feel free to text any questions to this question line number here on the screen, and Ben will get those and pepper them in as he sees fit. So, in the aftermath of U.S. Marriage equality, dominant political and legal rhetoric tends to pit religious liberty against LGBTQ rights. In this context, the LDS Church has been a prominent voice advocating for greater religious liberty protections. Latter-day Saint legislators have sponsored versions of a Religious Freedom Restoration Act across the country and on the federal level. But what if religion, sexuality, and gender identity were not seen as being at odds, and instead LGBTQ equality were pursued on the basis of religious liberty? A growing number of mainstream faiths affirm same-sex couples' relationships, including solemnizing their marriages. Diverse faith groups and religious observers also affirm LGBTQ persons' place in civic life and agree that faith-based organizations not only should not discriminate against LGBTQ people when those organizations enter the civil sphere, but that they should in fact defend LGBTQ rights as an expression of their religion. This panel, like I said, of adjudicators, litigators, and legal scholars will explore the potential impact of legal and legislative efforts to protect LGBTQ rights on religious liberty grounds. Take it away, Ben.
Okay, thank you. So I want to thank all of you for sticking around. I know late Saturday afternoon is after a day full of, even if they're great events, sometimes it can be taxing on your attention spans. But I'm also grateful for the panelists. I know a lot of work has gone into the remarks they've planned to share. So I'm a mediator. I teach mediation and I practice mediation, and so I love the idea of bringing people together and finding new ways to solve problems. That's what we do in mediation. My role here is not necessarily to get the panelists to agree, but to help facilitate some rigorous thought and maybe some new thinking about ways that we might address these challenging issues. So my role is as speakers, everyone will have 15 minutes to share their thoughts. I will follow up after each person speaks to ask some questions. And so please, as Kendall mentioned, feel free to text your questions. And then after everyone's presented, we'll have more question discussion. And again, I welcome your questions, and I'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So we're just going to start on the far end of the table with Christine, and then work our way down. So Christine, please go ahead.
All right, thank you very much, and thanks to the planners of this program for inviting my participation. Is that better? Yeah, I can hear it. I can hear the echo. I began my career in the gender wars. Started out proselytizing for ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, studying sex discrimination in the law, doing some litigation in that arena. And it's so fascinating to me to see the way in which ideas about equality under the law have evolved and have come to be explored in the context of so many different kinds of minorities. Women, of course, are not a numerical minority, but historically in this country, they have been a legal minority for much of our history. I'm reminded I have a good friend who was Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court the same time I was chief here in Utah, and we got to be friends. And she told me one time that in her early career, she was born in South Africa and began her career working in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and talked about how astonished she was to find herself the author of the Goodrich opinion, which was the first case in the United States which declared bans on same-sex marriage to be unconstitutional under the Massachusetts Constitution. So we all travel interesting journeys in our lives. And I like the emphasis that I've heard in the part of the conference that I've been listening to on the notion of a journey that we are all on, and the necessity for us to find ways to make it worthwhile. There are a number of things by way of background that I'd like to have more time to go into, but I just want to mention a few and then say a few things about the primary focus of our discussion this afternoon. I wanted to mention the enormous changes in the world of work, which have a great deal of impact on LGBTQ issues. And the first of those is the huge sea change in the status and the nature of the roles of corporate entities. This started in the elections context with Citizens United, but we see it more recently and in the context of LGBTQ issues in instances where businesses, small and large, have taken on the role of espousing beliefs. We don't usually think of corporations as people, but in the context of American law these days, they have many of the same rights and roles that human beings have. There's also been, of course, an expansion of protection for corporate beliefs, and especially with respect to religious freedom under RFRAs and the federal RFRA, Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and state laws. So that the issues of religion and work have come to dominate much of our discussion. But at the same time, there is an increasingly expansive view, particularly in state legislation, of what religious beliefs include. And some of those expansive notions have been extended to beliefs that are predicated on moral convictions, on conscience-based convictions, and one can argue that dedication to the notions of fairness, equality, and basic human rights are indeed precisely those kinds of moral and conscience-based considerations that are protected under many so-called religious protection statutes. My comments today are directed to the point that the collisions between these sets of beliefs are not necessarily binary and straightforward, that they are in fact complex and evolving, and I think the other members of the panel will be elaborating on those themes. Much of the discussion that concerns religious-based exemptions to anti-discrimination laws, particularly those that affect LGBTQ individuals, has focused exclusively on the dynamic between the rights of protected individuals on the one hand and the free exercise rights of other individuals or entities. Another dimension of the debates is emerging in the form of considerations that focus on competing religious or conscientious values, as I've just mentioned, that are also protected by free exercise principles or by statute. Religious or conscience-based objections to legal rules may arise in many settings and from widely different, deeply held beliefs. Outside the LGBTQ arena, but illustrative, I think, is the emerging sanctuary movement that some of you may have read about, in which citizen groups, churches, and some public institutions, such as local governments, are advocating theories of protection for religious or conscience-based objections to enforcement of certain immigration laws. Directly relevant to LGBTQ issues are arguments that to regard religion and LGBTQ protections as always in conflict creates a false dichotomy. We've got some data, we need more. In 2014, the Pew Research Foundation did a poll that found that a majority, 51%, and this is of millennial evangelical Protestants, believe that, quote, homosexuality should be accepted by society, unquote. Those are evangelicals, and a majority of them espoused that belief in 2014. 45% of them supported same-sex marriage as opposed to only 23% of their elders. That's a sea change in attitudes in a particular religious community that I think offers us some sense of what kind of evolution is going on. And these numbers demonstrate that there's not a unilateral religious view of the issues. A growing number of mainstream faiths and religious congregations have accepted and affirmed same-sex marriages and have openly supported transgender and gender nonconforming individuals. The point is that large numbers of Americans of faith reject the notion that religion as a generality, or people of faith as a generality, generally reject or oppose protections of equality for LGBTQ individuals. That, again, may not be entirely consistent with or coherent with the experience of individuals in specific communities, but it is an indication that there's a great deal of diversity and scope. These arguments rely in significant part on the third-party harm. Because I should have mentioned at the beginning, like others on the panel, I'm a lawyer and a former judge, and my life, although containing dedication to fairness, equal rights, and human rights, is also steeped in the law, the Constitution, and statutes. And I realize that some of what we're talking about this afternoon have a lot to do with the Constitution as interpreted by courts, or I should say the constitutions, because there are state as well as federal constitutions, and the statutes, but there is a sense in which I think we who are engaged in the work of litigation in an adversary system need to be pushed outside of our comfort zone from time to time, and that may be something we'll be able to talk about. Justice Kennedy, so I was talking about third-party harm and the concern that it raises in religious rights cases, and the doctrine is that one of the factors that should be considered in whether religious liberty or religious free exercise claims should trump individual rights to not be discriminated against has in significant part a concern about how much harm will be done in the protection of rights to discriminate. Justice Kennedy, in his concurring opinion in the Hobby Lobby case, that's the contraceptive case in which a closely held corporation was affirmed by the United States Supreme Court to have the right to refuse to pay for contraceptive services under its medical insurance plans for its employees on the basis of a religious objection to contraception. There's a lot to be said about the case that I won't say now, but I do want to quote this language from Justice Kennedy's concurring opinion. He stated the principle of third-party harm very succinctly. Among the reasons the United States is so open, so tolerant, and so free is that no person may be restricted or demeaned by government in exercising his or her religion. Yet, neither may that same exercise unduly restrict other persons, such as employees, in protecting their own interests the law deems compelling. And in that consideration lies the balancing act that I think we're talking about in our panel here this afternoon. How do we reconcile rather than pit the interests of different communities with each other in terms of the public polity without doing damage to anyone, or at least without doing unnecessary damage to anyone? Research suggests that significant third-party harm can be done when LGBTQ people are denied services in the public sphere or included from participation otherwise open to the public. For example, a recent study published in the Journal of American Medicine, JAMA, Journal of Medical Association. My husband's here and he's a physician. JAMA has a psychiatry branch of its publications, and this study identified a 46% increase in the proportion of sexual minority adults experiencing medical distress in states with laws permitting denial of services to such minorities. Now, that's like some of the data we heard in the last session. That's a correlation, not a causal effect. But it raises some very interesting questions about the relationships between legal restrictions and law and what happens to people in their daily lives. Some people argue that, quote, allowing discrimination in providing services to the LGBTQ community has a powerful cumulative impact and must be considered a third-party harm. Now, this is where some of my long experience in working with various forms of discrimination informs perhaps my perspective. There are experiences of humiliation, exclusion, and degradation that happen to people who are treated as less than and other in society. I know this from my work in gender discrimination. I have seen it and studied it in the context of race discrimination. I mean, you think about the whole rationale for Brown versus Board of Education. There was huge amounts of social data on the impact on black children of being in so-called separate but equal institutions. And that was one of the tipping points for the Supreme Court in determining that segregation was unconstitutional. Stigma in the marketplace has been explicitly recognized as causing harm in the United States Supreme Court's Obergefell, the same-sex marriage case. And in referencing Masterpiece Cake Shop, that's the Colorado baker who did not wish to provide a cake to a same-sex couple for their wedding celebration. Professor and litigator Mary Bonato of GLAD and Harvard Law School argues that the case is more about just a baker's freedom. This was not a perspective espoused by the United States Supreme Court, but it's an interesting one. She wrote that the case was also about equal citizenship of gay people.
1 minute.
What?
1 minute.
1 minute, good. And whether we may engage in the kind of ordinary transactions that others take for granted. All this is simply to acknowledge that at issue in these debates is a wide array of concerns about the values embraced by our republic, especially those related to treatment under the law, and to religious and moral convictions about what it is to be human, to be a citizen, and to be a religious person. As we explore, it is worthwhile to recognize that people of faith do not see these issues through a single lens, and the questions are not limited to belief versus unbelief, but often to sincerely held belief versus sincerely held belief. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. So you mentioned, I think rightly, that this has become a lot more nuanced, and your phrase, it's not just belief versus unbelief, it's belief versus belief. Even in that case, when beliefs are colliding, how do you decide which prevails? I remember a case in law school our first year. There was, I think it was called Miller v. Schoen, and there's a guy who has apple trees and a guy who has cedar trees on their properties. And the cedar trees give off some rust that damages the apple trees, and the state government decides that apples are a more important public good, and so they order the cedar trees to be destroyed. And the court upheld that decision by the state government because they said that the apples were there was a stronger public interest in that. And so, as we think about it in this case, how do you when beliefs are colliding as a judge, what type of tools do you use? You had cited a public opinion poll. Is that a tool that you use, or what are the things that you would use when you're sort of forced to decide belief versus belief?
Well, certainly empirical data is an appropriate tool for the courts to reference in determining, for example, the outcome under a specific legal standard like third-party harm. But that doesn't get you very far in terms of your question. And part of the problem with your question is it depends on the arena. If you're talking about litigation in an adversary system, then the courts are going to have to depend upon the language of statutes, the perceived intent of the statute, and sometimes those policy decisions about what's better for the community as a whole don't belong to judges. They belong to legislatures. And of course, some of the fundamental allocations have been made in the underlying constitutional language. So judges don't always have a lot of play. And it's really interesting because there's an enormous amount of work going on. If you look at the lower court cases, we have a handful, really, of United States Supreme Court cases in the federal arena. But then you've got all of these lower court cases, both in state court and federal court around the country, which are coming to different conclusions. You have things like let me get the case name right. The Harris, well, no, that's a federal case. I was thinking about the Arizona Court of Appeals decided in a case called Brush versus Nebula Studios that public accommodation anti-discrimination law, in other words, prohibitions against discriminating against people in accessing businesses and public accommodations, did not compel speech in favor of same-sex marriage. So that goes contrary to the arguments in the Masterpiece Cake case. And of course, the Masterpiece Cake case has left the fundamental issue still unanswered. It reversed the lower court decision based on some really procedural grounds and concerns. So I realize I haven't nailed your question because it's just too hard. But there are one of the things the courts are going to have to do is to develop principles and standards of priorities. And some suggestions include that under RFRA, courts should distinguish between laws that force active participation by people seeking religious protections in activities that violate their beliefs versus passive toleration, and whether the former deserve more protection than the latter. And there are other specific principles that the courts can work on in that arena.
Okay, thank you. One other follow-up question. So you mentioned third-party harm, and you were talking about the real harm that occurs with discrimination against LGBTQ people. Are there third-party harms on the other side of the equation that should be taken into account?
Well, there are, and it's where this sort of corporate entity discussion becomes really relevant, because what, for example, if the employees and the shareholders of a corporation, a publicly held corporation, for example, completely disagree with the manager's determination of what religious beliefs and conscientious beliefs require. And they, in fact, are harmed because their beliefs, say in support of anti-discrimination, are in fact being violated by the activities of the company that is seeking protection from or exemptions from the anti-discrimination law. So it seems to me that those would be other kinds of third-party harms in the community.
Okay. Alex, sure, go ahead.
Yeah. Justice Durham, this is so wonderful, by the way, to sit on a panel with Justice Durham. Usually I'm down on the floor and she's asking me hard questions. And so this is a big ego trip for me. Isn't it the case that a lot of these conflicts really have to be adjudicated by carefully looking at the context and the facts? We sort of have these legal principles, and in order to really make them make sense, we have to look very deeply at the facts that are going on.
I think that's absolutely true, that context matters a great deal. And just the factual circumstances in the couple of cases I've alluded to, and in response to these questions, I think illustrates that. So you're absolutely right. The facts matter a great deal.
Okay, thank you. Shannon.
Okay. Well, hey, everybody. I'm just so thrilled to be at this conference. I just want to say that I've been so moved. It's wonderful to be here. So I'm an LGBT civil rights litigator, and I'm really was intrigued by the framing of this panel and the recognition that not all religious faiths or denominations are hostile or unfriendly to LGBT people. And in fact, as Justice Durham noted, many of them are becoming much more supportive. If you just look at the history of the LGBT movement, of course, from almost the very beginning, we've had cases that have pitted religious liberty against LGBT rights. And what we're seeing is that's really escalated after same-sex couples won this nationwide freedom to marry in Obergefell. There's just been, the conflict's really intensified, and we just have an explosion, really, of there's dozens and dozens of state bills, proposed legislation that would seek to create new religious exemptions for people who disagree with that marriage equality decision in Obergefell or who don't want to accommodate transgender people. And one of the most extreme is in Mississippi in 2016 passed a law which literally specifically said if you hold one of 3 identified religious beliefs, you get sort of a free pass from any prevailing law, and those 3 beliefs are that marriage is for a man and a woman, that marriage is reserved for heterosexual marriage, and that a person's gender can't be changed. And then the Trump administration has passed a lot of new, were promulgated a lot of new federal regulations and policies that create some, quite broad new religious exemptions to anti-discrimination law. So, I mean, it's really interesting to think about, well, could we use religious liberty as a counterweight to some of these efforts, given that there's more religious or people of faith who support freedom and equality for LGBT people? Is there some way to sort of do a tit for tat and kind of enshrine those more positives beliefs in the law? But I think, in general, civil rights advocates have really not gone down that road, and I think there's a good reason why. Because if we sort of accept the premise that religious liberty somehow means that people who hold particular religious beliefs and values can enshrine those beliefs into the practical matter, it would just create more religious and cultural conflict. If you just think about it, boy, I mean, people living, if that would look very different in different parts of the country, even different communities within states, the law would, if they were going to reflect, whatever dominant religious values were in that area, I just think it would lead to a lot more polarization. So that might actually be great for LGBT people who live in progressive urban enclaves, but it would not be so great for those who lived in other places. And even in terms of those urban enclaves, I think it likely would create backlash that would hurt us in other parts of the country. And we have seen a little bit already. California, a couple years ago, this moment thought about, this law never even got introduced as a bill, but thought about withholding state Pell Grants to certain religious schools that were invoking their federal exemption that allows private religious schools to discriminate against LGBT students if they wish to. Just the mere mention of that law created a pretty severe backlash in other parts of the country. I think the real problem with this idea of wanting to sort of say, okay, well, more anti-LGBT religious beliefs often get embodied in the law, or at least there's now real aggressive attempts to embody those beliefs in the law, so let's try to balance that by putting more emphasis on people of faith who don't share those beliefs. The problem with that, in addition to the practical problems I just mentioned, is I think it really just falls into this very unfortunate assumption that this whole issue is really about conflict between two separate groups of adults. You got LGBT people and progressive religious people on one side, and then conservative religious individuals on the other. And the reality is that for many LGBT children and young people, their core identities and allegiances are in both of those camps, because many of them are living in conservative religious communities. So I don't want us to leave out the young people when we're think this is all about adults. I really think that neither side here, neither the LGBT advocates or conservative religious liberty advocates, have really come to grips or thought enough about those young people. I'll just say from kind of my side of the fence, what I see is when LGBT advocates think about young people living in conservative religious communities, they honestly tend to think of them as like, they're like temporary hostages living across enemy lines, and we're just waiting for them to grow up and they can be rescued from these terrible places. There's one LGBT leader recently wrote in an article, he says, many queer people have left spiritually abusive households and don't want anything to do with religion. Some of the loudest LGBT pundits are atheists and are critical of LGBT people who adhere to religions that at least formally condemn same-sex relationships. Then on the other side of the equation, I think there's religious liberty advocates who often would just prefer not to acknowledge that there are LGBT kids living in their communities, and conservative advocates often emphasize the importance of freedom of association, the idea that the right of people who share a faith and share particular religious values and beliefs to join together to create separate spaces and institutions that should be respected under the law, and that's very important. But that framework of voluntary association and choice, it just doesn't apply very well to children. I mean, some people do convert to another faith as adults, but most of us, we're not just born into a family or a community, but we're born into a faith, if we're going to have one. And then children also are just completely dependent on parents and other adults. I mean, there's very few things that are more distressing to most of us than the thought of a child that's on his or her own and separated from any family or community support. And I just want to say, however resilient LGBT people may be, that's tough for kids. Kids need the support of their family. But that continues to be the experience of a lot of LGBT children and young people. I mean, you might think, I really thought about this a lot, because on the face of it, it doesn't make sense. You might think that all the progress that we've made around LGBT legal protections would reduce family rejection of LGBT children. And I do think that will happen, and is happening in the long run. But in the short run, it's just the opposite. And there's actually, we know why that is, because of the increased visibility and knowledge around LGBT issues. Kids are coming out at much, much younger ages. I mean, it used to be 19, 20, and not till you left home. Now it's 9 or 10, or even younger for some transgender kids. And so that creates a situation where you have children who have come out to their families, and they have this long window of vulnerability and dependence on a family who may have absolutely no idea or resources about how to understand or deal with an LGBT child. So because of that, this new research, it's not that new anymore, but there's a growing body of research about the impact of family rejection on LGBT young people. I bet you probably most of the people in this room are familiar with Caitlin Ryan's research. Yes, I'm seeing heads nodding. That youth in highly rejecting families are 8 times more likely to attempt suicide, more than 6 times more likely to be dealing with really serious depression, and about 3.5 times more likely to be using drugs or having unprotected sex. I mean, these are serious, really serious negative health impacts. In a lot of these cases, the rejecting families are engaging in rejecting behaviors because of their religious beliefs. They feel they have to choose between their LGBT child and their religious beliefs. And these families, I think it's so important to understand, genuinely love their children. Of course they do and want to help them, but they don't understand that by pressuring their child to change or to view themselves as broken or defective, they're causing these really serious harms. So what happens is you end up with a lot of LGBT adults who get wounded by those experiences and dealing with lifelong problems, and then also often get very alienated from religion. But maybe that's why the LGBT movement, and I've been working in this movement for 26 years now, just taking this really narrow and mostly ineffective approach to toward dealing with all these issues and dealing with this family rejection of LGBT kids. And that approach, I think, it just summed up in the slogan, "It gets better." That was the name of a campaign started by a gay journalist, and it was intended to give hope to young people who are being rejected or bullied or harassed. And the implicit message of that campaign, I think, is not just that it gets better later, but that it gets better somewhere else. It pretty much tells young people, hey, if you can hang on, don't take your own life till you get to adulthood, then you can leave your home, move away to an LGBT-friendly city, find a partner, make new friends, and have a happy life. And I want to be really clear, I don't mean to be critical of that campaign. It's absolutely been critical and it saved people's lives. But I do think it kind of really indicts our collective failure. Like, it just cannot be that the best we can do for a whole group of young people who are suffering so severely is urge them, hey, do your best until you're old enough to leave home. That's just not good enough. And I wanted to share with you all a story. This story has just haunted me since I heard it. It's been a couple years now, but somebody who was researching a book on LGBT young people was interviewing kids, talked to a young man in North Carolina. He was 15. He was having a hard time at school, getting harassed, and his family was giving him a hard time because they really believed that being gay was immoral and sinful. And she said that she just found herself kind of falling into that framework and telling him, please just, hang on. It will get better. And when you turn 18, you can move to a city and you'll have more options. And I promise you'll be much happier. And he said to her, thank you, ma'am, but I don't want to move to a city. I don't want to leave my family and my church. And when the time comes, I want to sit with my parents and grandparents in heaven. I'll just say that the truth is that for the most part, the LGBT movement just doesn't have anything very helpful to say to that young man. If you were just to survey the entire LGBT movement with all the organizations and resources, and you were looking for how many of them provide any sort of education, information, or services to conservative families raising LGBT children, the answer would be virtually none. I want to say that's one of the reasons why this conference is so important, and the work that you are doing here really is hugely significant. Because generally that silence, just that vacuum, leaves young people in these families in the LGBT. You have to, and on the other hand, the message they hear from their own families and their communities is very unclear. What are they being told? I mean, most can't see any path forward for themselves, any positive path forward, because they're not part any longer of any shared positive cultural or religious story about what their future is supposed to look like. And I think parents and family members just face that same kind of blank slate. They literally can't imagine what a good or happy future for their child who's gay or transgender, what would that look like? And so that, of course, that's the dynamic that leads right to family rejection. But then the research also shows that when families are given the information in a sensitive way, respectful way, that the very things they're doing to protect their children, to discourage them from being gay or transgender, are really hurting them. I mean, that gets through. Nobody wants to hurt their own kids, and people do then modify their behavior. I think that's one of the most hopeful aspects of this research. And in fact, it shows, and this was a big deal to find this out, that you can get almost all those health impacts about suicide, depression, and so forth. You don't have to get families all the way to being celebratory. Just getting them from being highly rejecting to being even ambivalent gets rid of almost all the negative health impacts. So, that's an important thing to know from an education and policy perspective. And I just hope this is okay, but I just want to briefly share a personal story. And to me, just really bears that out. You know, I'm a transgender man. I was born female. I was raised as a girl. I had, like so many people, I had a lot of struggles as a child, and I grew up in a very conservative family, religious family in East Texas. And when my parents discovered that I had a girlfriend, because you have to remember at that time I was identified as female, so I thought I was a lesbian. You know, they did all the stuff that the family research says you're not supposed to do, the shaming, the isolation, the silence. And I now know, of course, as an adult, that they were acting out of love. But my experience of that as a child was that one day my parents loved me and the next day they didn't, after they found out about who I was. And
I don't think I would have made it as a child if it wasn't
for Mr. Jackson. He was my government teacher. He was a very conservative, fundamentalist, Christian evangelical man. And I told him what was going on. We had been friends already. And he made me meet with him every morning before class to check in. And he told me that he wanted me to know that from his perspective as a Christian, yeah, being gay was sinful. There was no more sinful than a lot of other things, including things that he had done, and that it didn't change, his regard for me. And, that just hearing those things from a supportive adult was enough for me to survive. And I'm sharing that because I really think it underscores the point that the kind of changes that we need to see for LGBT young people in conservative religious communities are not going to look like our, idealized secular version of what acceptance and support looks like. It's not necessarily going to be like rainbow flags and gay pride stickers.
30 seconds.
Okay, and it's not necessarily going to change doctrines about marriage or family or sexual ethics in these communities. It's going to look really different. And we have to let these communities develop their own organic ways to include and support their own children on their own terms. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. So you mentioned one reason you think that framing LGBT rights as religious liberty rights would be problematic is some of the polarization that might follow. Do you think, though, that maybe that's just a necessary part of sorting out things like this? Christine mentioned Brown v. Board, and certainly after that case came out, there was polarization. So is polarization sufficient reason to avoid taking that approach, do you think?
Yes, I do. Look, there's a fundamental legal question here. The legal question that keeps coming up is, do religious groups, schools, employers have a right to an exemption from anti-discrimination laws? And what I don't want to see happen, I do not want to see that issue resolved by the U.S. Supreme Court or by state Supreme Courts, because when it is resolved in court, it's resolved on constitutional grounds. It's kind of an all or nothing, winner take all. Constitutional principles by their very nature are very broad and sweeping. What I would far prefer is what happened here in Utah. Utah is a wonderful example. In 2015, you reminded me, I had the year wrong. Utah, the LGBT advocates and representatives of the LDS Church and the state legislature really, and they've gone through a very long process of building bridges, building trust, getting to know each other, sat down and worked out a very good anti-discrimination law that provides protections for LGBT people, also provides protections for religious freedom. And it has been so successful. It's changed so many positive things have come about as a result of that. Utah is now, there was a recent poll that showed Utah is, I think, second in the country in terms of support for LGBT people, better than California. And I think, yeah.
I just have to chime in and say, even as someone who's spent my entire career in the law and the courts, you're right that court-based decisions are very limited and can do harm. Sometimes they are unavoidable, and sometimes they're absolutely necessary. And sometimes they do some good too, by the way. But you have a good point.
Tell them what we're doing on a national level.
You go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Shannon.
Well, there is a similar effort which Alexander has been very involved in. I've been involved in as well, to try to replicate that at the federal level. I mean, this has been like years now in the works of a very serious, intensive, weekend-long meetings.
Lots of yelling.
Lots of yelling. Alexander and I had a few fights along the way to try to replicate Utah at the national level and really identify what, if we're going to pass a federal anti-discrimination law, which we urgently need for LGBT people. Only 22 states in this country have state laws. Most of the country, there's no protections against being fired for being gay or transgender or anything else, any other type of discrimination. And it's a really solid piece of work. It's hopefully about to be introduced, and it addresses all the tension spots and the conflicts, but it does it in a very, like you were saying, fact-specific, context-specific way. But what you should add here?
Sure.
Yeah, it's been a remarkable journey. It's taken 3 years, and the goal has been to be respectful of the very real human and institutional interests at stake. Nothing in this area is perfect. It's not possible to get to perfection, but it is possible to get to something that's quite good and that allows people to live together with respect and in peace. And so that's what we've been working on, and stay tuned.
So, as you know, that the Utah Compromise has been criticized by people on both sides, conservative religious people and also gay rights advocates.
That's a good sign.
What do you say to critics on either side of that?
Well, Alexander, you might be able to speak better to critics on the religious conservative side, but I don't think any of the fears that people had on that side have come to pass. Like, there have not been issues or problems with enforcing the anti-discrimination provisions, and I think the fears on my side that the religious exemptions would be too broad have similarly just not panned out. I mean, that law has done nothing but significantly improve the climate here in the state for LGBT people who now know they have that protection. That makes a huge difference. Subsequently, the legislature got rid of the so-called no promo homo law. I hate that language, but the law that prevented anything positive from being said about LGBT people in schools. There's hate crimes legislation, some positive family law decisions. I hope that the Utah Licensing Board is on the verge of passing what would be a very good protection for LGBT young people against conversion therapy. And it's just, it's led to nothing but enormously positive results.
Okay. If you want to weigh in on
I
that,
think one of the important things to remember is that the law can be a teacher. It can't fix everything. It shouldn't try to fix everything. I'm going to address that in my remarks. But it can be a teacher. And society responds to teaching moments. And the 2015 Utah Compromise was a teaching moment. And culture and society shifted. It didn't shift all the way. Some here wish it would shift a lot more. But it did shift, and it made a big difference. And so law has limits. And trying to impose too much law in too many spaces is not a good idea. But properly used, law can be an agent of significant change for the better. So,
thank you. Shannon, one last question for you. You talked about this problem with family rejection of LGBTQ youth. So the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has a belief in traditional marriage between a man and a woman. The church also has a strong belief in strong, loving families. Do you have ideas, or are you aware of any models of institutional efforts to try and reconcile those things? Is there anything that the institution can do, or is this something that just needs to happen on an individual or grassroots level?
Well, I can't obviously cannot speak for the LDS Church at all. But no, I think sure it can happen on an institutional level, and it is happening on an institutional level, as well as the individual families and homes and groups, like Mama Bears and. But yeah, no, the churches, it's been wonderful. They've changed their position, their official position on conversion therapy, and made clear that that's not something that's supported. and encouraged, made clear too. The website that talks about these issues has these wonderful hypotheticals that based on questions about, oh, well, if I find out my child is gay, does that mean I shouldn't, invite them to dinner anymore? And the answer is
Oh, of course you should invite them. I mean, there's wonderful, positive things happening at the institutional level. And as we heard last night from the keynote, there's also just really important, I think, very doctrinal discussions
going on about, that aspect of these issues. But it's, I think there's a lot of really, really important, significant, positive institutional change. It's good to talk about the doctrine, but it's not necessarily all about teaching doctrine. It's about finding ways to support these young people and let them know that they're loved and supported no matter what.
And I'd just like to add another example of ways in which
evolve outside,
not necessarily within final changes, and that has to do with the demographics in the LDS Church. For a long time, the only model for families was
family.
married couple and children. And it's become increasingly clear over a number of years now that that does not represent a majority of the families in the LDS Church. And what you've seen are programs, speakers who address the issue of single parents, who talk about the presence of non-traditional families, and hopefully they don't even call them that anymore, but of diversity of family life in the church, and a lot more resources and curriculum in the church's teaching efforts to support those people and those families. So that kind of change, I think, can also occur in the arena we're discussing today.
Thank you. Alex.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Those of you who hang on long enough to hear the legal part of any conference are the true diehards. So, thank you. I hope I'm not one of Professor Lee Beckstead's, red light people. It's not my intent. But I'm here to talk a little bit about the limits of legal rights talk in these sensitive areas. Lawyers love to pretend that legal concepts ought to be extended into all kinds of areas. In fact, almost every area. We tend to like to use language that is legalistic in the numerous areas of life. Sometimes that works, but often it doesn't. And I think there are some real challenges with using what is sometimes referred to as rights talk in the context of these concerns that we're discussing here. I'm going to talk about a couple of powerful words and do so from the perspective of someone who represents what might be referred to as conservative or traditional religious organizations. Organizations that are trying. They don't see themselves as trying to harm anyone, but are trying to be true and faithful to the truths that they understand in a context that is changing, and trying to understand how to adapt the teachings and the truths that they know and want to be faithful to the new circumstances that they might encounter. Gathering is a powerful religious concept. Think of the concept in the Latter-day Saint community of Zion, that a people would gather together and they would become of one heart and one mind, and they would dwell together in righteousness, and that there would be no poor among them, that they would be the pure in heart and be such that they could be the kind of people ready to welcome the Lord. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I also, Christ said. The need to gather in the company and communion of the faithful lies at the heart of many, perhaps all religions. In community, believers define and live out their beliefs about God, salvation, love, sin, suffering, marriage, family, giving, receiving, all the defining issues of life. In their gatherings, believers discern and define who they are, how they should live, and what they should become. It is there, as in the home, that they teach and guide their children in the faith. It is there that faith and religion gain and retain the strength to survive another generation in the face of secularism's centrifugal forces. For the faithful, gathering is an existential matter. As gathering lies at the heart of religion, so too the legal right to gather lies at the heart of any serious account of religious freedom. No meaningful freedom to gather, no meaningful religious freedom. Without the right to gather, religion struggles to take human form and reality. Despots, ancient and modern, have long known this. The Romans persecuted early Christians, Protestants in 17th century England persecuted Catholics, and on and on. The power of faith eventually overcomes such persecutions. But at the center of that overcoming are the brave acts of gathering, secret and dangerous, that empower the faithful to break the bonds of tyranny. Gathering is an important religious concept and religious need, and it needs to be accounted for. Discrimination is another powerful concept. Certainly in legal terms, it suggests a malevolence that calls for moral condemnation and stigma. To discriminate is to commit a wrong, to sin socially. But that word and the morality that it embodies have limits. It cannot reach all distinctions, even in respect to sensitive areas. We do not, for example, intelligibly use the word discrimination to describe someone's choice of a spouse or a friend. The word has some limits. In legal and policy context, terms like discrimination and discriminate must be limited to zones of human action where, one, there is broad consensus that it is morally wrong to make certain distinctions, and two, where the law can appropriately and reasonably mitigate the wrong without trenching on other core values inherent in our tradition of liberty and limited government. Otherwise, the enforcement of malleable non-discrimination norms risks becoming a tool of coercion in the service of other orthodoxies, which then will generate their own set of injustices and grievances. There are, in other words, important areas of life where non-discrimination norms should typically prevail, and some where they shouldn't. So in the area where non-discrimination norms should typically prevail, for example, is in the area of the commercial sphere. For over a century, the state has closely regulated commerce. Business is simply not a libertarian zone. It just isn't. Government regulates all kinds of things. The notion of the common marketplace and the common inn open to all has deeply ancient roots. In a commercial society like America, participation in commercial life on reasonable equal terms, free of unjust discrimination, has come to be understood as a right of citizenship. Now, there are, of course, nuances at times, and we don't need to try to squeeze religion out of the commercial sphere entirely, but there are limits when you're a religious person and you enter the commercial sphere. That's just the reality of being in a commercial space in the public marketplace. But religion and religious organizations are different. There is no common church or common faith community in the United States that all may access by right. It's different here than, say, in the Church of England, where everyone has a right to enter. The sphere of religious gathering in churches, synagogues, mosques, religious schools, religious charities is not one where non-discrimination norms can have full sway legally. Indeed, most often such norms should have virtually no legal sway at all. In America, you can be a member of any church that will have you, or you can start your own, but you cannot employ the force of law to force your way in. The right of believers to gather in religious settings includes and must include the right to say who qualifies as a believer, who is part of the gathering, free from state oversight or control. America owes much of its religious diversity to that right, which has secured the autonomy of faith communities to form and govern themselves on their own terms, and then divide and subdivide in their ongoing quest to find and know God. And the result of that diversity, taken as a whole, is a profound inclusiveness, almost ironically. that affords to each person a meaningful community for the expression of faith, or at least the freedom to start one that will better suit one's own faith preferences and needs. The future of religious freedom and of religion itself will greatly depend on the willingness of political, legal, and social elites to recognize and protect a robust right to gather. People of faith must have meaningful spaces in which to freely form and govern communities of faith based on common beliefs, practices, goals, and standards. This includes not only traditional religious organizations like churches, but also religious schools and charities and orders and many other gatherings where faith finds expression, meaning, and substance. Without such protection and active preservation, the overwhelming forces of government, market, technology, media, and ideological secularism threaten to crush religion and the religious. Part of the threat that exists to faith communities lurks in the abuse of non-discrimination norms. We simply have to be careful about how we use the words that we use when we're talking about religion. To describe as discrimination what religious people do when they gather in unity and faith and make the self-defining distinctions essential to such gatherings is not only inaccurate, it is dangerous. Misusing the morally powerful language of discrimination in this context condemns and threatens to delegitimize both the religion itself and the essential organizations that give it life. It threatens to homogenize and control religion, bureaucratizing it in the image of the dominant secular morality. It threatens to drain religious organization of their authenticity and vitality. And so importing rights talk into the religious sphere is often not very productive. The place and future of LGBT persons within faith communities is part of an ongoing conversation of religious self-definition. That's important to understand. That's what this conference is about to an extent. An ongoing process of self-definition. It's part of, in a sense, the gathering. Sometimes that conversation leads to reevaluation and change. And at other times, it doesn't. I have my theories, but of course I don't know how the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints will address LGBT issues in the days, months, and years to come. But I know the conversation will continue among leaders and faithful members who seek to obey and love and commune and gather more perfectly in the name of the Lord. And I also know that recognizing and creatively protecting the fundamental moral and legal right to gather in religious communities remains an essential effort for everyone who cares about preserving religion and our heritage of religious freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. A couple of follow-up questions. So you talked about the term discrimination being a powerful term and when it's appropriate to use that. And one of the legal and policy contexts that you mentioned where it is appropriate is where there's broad consensus that it's morally wrong to make certain distinctions. That we should use the term discrimination only when there's broad consensus in those contexts. Christine had mentioned a study, and I'll mention another from Pew this year that said 61% of Americans support same-sex marriage. So the question is, what are your thoughts about what constitutes broad consensus in the context of LGBTQ equality, and is something like 61% of Americans supporting same-sex marriage, is that broad consensus, or what would that look like in your
opinion? I'm talking about a moral consensus, and yes, there's a broad moral consensus that discrimination against LGBT persons is wrong. Now, the question is, where does that, wrong when? Okay? It can't be an act of sexual orientation discrimination, to take a silly example, for a heterosexual to prefer another heterosexual as a mate, right? So we know, we don't use the word discriminate there. And there are lots of other places where we can't use the word discriminate and then attach a law to it and then invade other spaces. There are simply other values that are at stake. And so, again, there needs to be enough of a consensus, but there also needs to be an understanding of the spaces and places where legal non-discrimination norms can realistically regulate. You wouldn't want to have a non-discrimination law, for example, that allows one person to sue his or her former friend and to say, well, you discriminated against me and not being my friend anymore. We just don't use it in those spaces. And the point I'm trying to make is the sensitive religious contexts are analogous to intimate spaces where we have to be extraordinarily careful about inserting the law. This is a deep part of our legal tradition, and it is part of the natural unfolding, the organic unfolding of religious organizations and faith communities. So this kind of dialogue that's been going on for the last couple of days is vitally important, but notice it's non-coercive. It's not about bringing lawsuits. It's about persuasion. It's about understanding. It's about facts that people perhaps hadn't considered previously. It's about figuring out how to come together and about what binds us, what divides us, and what we can change and what we can't. But it's not strictly about discrimination versus non-discrimination as lawyers understand those terms. So we have to be careful with those terms.
Okay, Christine, you wanted to respond?
I really would like to pursue a question. There's so much overlap. I really appreciate your comments and agree with so many of them, but I'm uneasy about the language you use when you say religion and religious organizations as being per se those intimate spaces that, as I understand your position, you believe to be really totally exempt from coercive standards that require those institutions to make choices. But I'm concerned, for example, if you take, and of course you do because you litigate on their behalf, church-based, religious-based educational organizations as an example, because educational organizations, at least in the arena of higher education, not so sure about secondary, but they have undertaken an educational mission which is in part regulated and overseen by public and legal standards, to wit things like accreditation and compliance standards. And when that occurs, I'm wondering, for example, and let's talk race rather than LGBTQ, because for some reason that has
This is
more
always
salience.
this is always the rhetorical move.
That's
right here.
exactly right. I'm making
Yeah.
the classic move.
Yeah.
And should a religious organization be allowed to be treated in an approving manner by federal regulators at the Department of Education if it refuses to admit or to educate any individual predicated on their race or ethnicity? And I realize we can't go to the end of that question here, but it does raise the question of how far that intimate space can extend itself outwards. You've been talking, I think, in terms of gathering in, but I'm concerned about extending the implications of gathering outward into the broader community.
Yeah, so quickly, you get into hard questions, okay? And the hard questions, however, can't lead to extreme answers. They can't lead to an answer that you have in slightly more public settings, like the religious universities, that you have absolute freedom. Nobody's arguing that. But by the same token, it cannot be argued that you have no freedom. And the racial analogy is always a bit problematic. That unique experience cannot be always used, and has not been always used by the law as the equivalent of other kinds of discrimination.
Yeah, but you have to make rational and defensible distinctions.
Sure. And one distinction is that's race. And race is different than, and the law has long understood it to be different than, for example, sex discrimination. religious discrimination, and now sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination.
but
we
it
don't
has-
try to meld those. So let me give you an example. For 2 decades, the Human Rights Campaign, and you're all familiar with the Human Rights Campaign, probably the largest LGBT rights group in the country. Not as good as yours, but still, very large. Supported the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. The Employment Non-Discrimination Act would add LGBT status to federal civil rights laws. It included a complete exemption for religious organizations. And for 2 decades, that was the position. Now, that would, of course, be different than from the law's treatment of those same organizations with respect to race. And so there's long been a recognition that we don't treat everything like race. We don't treat everything like sex. So.
There is a spectrum, but again, you have to explore very deeply the distinctions upon which those are based. I mean, race, you seem to be suggesting that because of the history of race in this country, it gets special status. But I was
Well, the courts have long suggested that.
Well, I thought we weren't going to depend on the courts to
Okay,
solve
no.
this problem.
But you're talking about legal intrusions within a religious college, for example, and that is illegal.
Well, and we have very little law on that. We've got the ancient Bob Jones University case, which everybody thinks is weird.
But
I'm
rightly
trying to
decided.
posit-
Yeah.
But I'm trying to posit in a more modern context, how, I guess, on the one hand, there's the question of how the courts would deal with that. And part of the problem is that one of the reasons race has been treated as it has is because of the entirely irrelevance of its status vis-a-vis bases for discrimination. And gender is a close second. I mean, women are still in a not as protected category as race, at least under the federal Constitution, which is one measure. But I guess what I'm concerned about is that from your comments, I took the impression that you were not acknowledging any limits on or any intrusions on that intimate space. But I gather you're suggesting that there are some you just...
Yeah, it just depends on how intimate.
Right.
Right? So intrusion within the family context, there better be
Right.
an absolutely powerful, compelling governmental reason, and it better be closely tied, to the very physical well-being, of a child. I mean, you've adjudicated many cases where, we don't just take children out of their families' homes. As you go on from there into the church space, the worshiping space, there are very, very few limits. I mean, the church autonomy doctrines that exist at the United States Supreme Court strongly limit that. As you move out from there into a religious organization and its employment structure, for example, its organizational administrative structure, there are protections there. And when you get out to religious schools, which of course are taking government money, there are restrictions there. My point, though, is let's treat those sensitively, because organic change within religious organizations is vastly better than coerced change. Part of the Utah Compromise was sort of an organic change that occurred. Yes, it was in the law, but it was more importantly kind of in the culture. And that was vastly more beneficial for LGBT people here in Utah than sort of invading those spaces. You don't, let me put a very fine point on it. You don't gain much if you invade BYU and force it to change legally. You're going to have a much better experience and much more harmony is going to come about if BYU is allowed to continue the dialogue that it is engaged in and figure out ways to be as inclusive as it needs to be.
If I just have a little footnote here, Alexander, per your point, like right now under federal law, the Title IX is the federal law that prohibits sex discrimination in publicly funded schools, and it has a really broad religious exemption that a school can just
File a letter.
File a letter, that's it. And so now that the federal courts for some time now have been saying that Title IX protects LGBT students, a lot of private religious schools have filed that letter so they can enforce their codes of conduct that, for example, some of them would lead to a student who's in a same-sex relationship, for example, being expelled. So we had a choice as LGBT advocates to either try to narrow that religious exemption or get rid of it. We could have done that. That's one path forward. Where I work, we made the choice not to do that for the very reasons that you said, because if the goal, and our goal, is to make the climate in those schools better for LGBT students and more supportive as quickly as possible, we think, and I believe firmly, that it is better. You will get to that result sooner by giving those schools the organic space to keep going through the process that they're going through. And, for example, we do this joint program, I guess you'd call it, with NCAA. It's called Common Ground, and every year we bring together LGBT advocates and representatives from these very, very religious, private religious schools to talk, and the whole focus is how can those schools better support their LGBT student athletes, but of course it spills over to the student body generally, and I've seen amazing change come from those.
Well, and BYU, just as one example, has participated very, very deeply in that. In fact, I think is now one of the leaders of that discussion.
Yeah, so you can either try to force the change through legal changes or this other path. And I think it depends, yeah.
Thank you. So I have a few questions from the audience to Alex, and I also had one as well that I'll sort of pull into one about this idea of gathering. Robin Wilson, who's a religious liberty scholar at University of Illinois Law School, she wrote, "Everybody knows that church sanctuaries are going to be out of reach of same-sex marriage laws. The whole fight is over religiously affiliated organizations and individuals who are in government employment or out in commerce." So when you talk about gathering, do you think that idea is right, that it's not really about the church sanctuary and kind of these inter-church practices? It's more about the masterpiece cake shop kind of scenarios?
No, I don't agree with that. I know Robin well. I don't agree with that for the very reasons that Justice Durham raised, because in her mind, it's not just about the marketplace. It extends into the religious organizations, at least the outer periphery of those organizations, and so there's much conversation going on there. I think the commercial cases, the cake bakers and things like that, those are eventually going to work themselves out. First of all, there aren't that many of those people. There aren't that many Christian cake bakers and florists and so forth who have an issue with baking cakes or arranging flowers. Now, there's some, but there aren't that many. And with a little bit of American kind of, figure it out and live and let live and, just kind of make it work-ism, for the most part, we're going to get around those. I wish the ACLU would quit making a federal case out of every single one of these. I mean, they really don't need to do that. But in any event, wherever you come down on that, I think those issues are going to be resolved. We're going to work out a pattern for dealing with them. I think the big temptation, especially for LGBT advocates, is going to be what they consider to be pockets of discriminatory people who have gathered together religiously, and how can the government influence those gatherings? And they're going to look at whether any government money is involved. They're going to look at whether they're employing people. They're going to look at whether they have spaces that kind of look and feel like public accommodations, and then there's going to be a significant impetus to try to push non-discrimination norms legally into those areas. And in some areas, that will be legitimate. But we got to be careful. Otherwise, you wind up with your religious space being highly regulated, and that can be dangerous.
Okay. On a related note, and I'd like to address this to all three members of the panel, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Last week, Andy Koppelman from Northwestern Law School came to BYU Law School, and he talked about this idea of religious liberty versus LGBTQ rights. And he has this idea that we should, keep it rooted in the First Amendment, but instead of a religious liberty issue, he thinks it should be he's floating this idea that it should be a free speech issue. And so his argument, well, I'll just read this simple summary of it. He says, the most sensible reconciliation of the tension between religious liberty and public accommodations law in the recent cases involving merchants with religious objections to same-sex marriage would permit business owners to present their views to the world, but forbid them either to threaten to discriminate or to treat any individual customer worse than others. Even if such businesses have no statutory right to refuse to facilitate ceremonies they regard as immoral, they are unlikely to be asked to participate in those ceremonies. And so his idea is people have a free speech right to present their views publicly, and if a business owner wants to do that, that's fine, as long as they're not discriminating. And he acknowledges that this is tricky, and he says that there's hostile work or hostile environment law that might make this difficult, but thinks that, sort of what Alex was saying, that the number of people doing this might be kind of small, and by allowing more public expression of views might help keep people who, if you have a gay couple who wants a wedding cake, away from the baker who feels, as a matter of religious conscience or belief, that they don't want to do that. So what are your thoughts about that? Does that seem like a legitimate way, as we're thinking about new ways to think about approaching and the tension here, does that seem workable to any of you?
I don't know how helpful it is, frankly. I was just reading an article by Doug Laycock at Virginia, and he was talking about the exceptions he would make. And as he talked about the cake baking case, he talked about the sacrament of marriage and how contributing to the celebration of a sacrament could legitimately be viewed as integral to religious belief. And so I don't know that the free speech, I don't necessarily agree with Doug on that. I think I personally tend to be on the other side of a cake is just a cake, and you don't espouse a view just because you put it on a cake. But there's a spectrum there. And so I guess I'm not overwhelmed with the notion. I mean, I certainly agree there are free speech issues, and I would love to see more of this in the free speech arena, because that's where people talk to each other, one hopes, as opposed to doing things that give rise to concerns about access to accommodations and treatment as equal citizens.
So he wrote a law review article on this. I don't know if he's published it yet.
He wrote
And
what?
he wrote a law review article on this subject. I don't know if it's been published yet. But I think his concept is basically someone comes in and says, I want a cake, and it's for my same-sex marriage, and I'd like you to bake it for me. And the baker says, I'm legally required by the law to do that, and I will. But I got to tell you, that's going to be hard for me. I have these religious beliefs about what marriage is, and this would be really, really hard for me to do. And so I'm asking you, kind of as a one citizen to another, if you could give me a pass.
Well, that's an interesting.
And if you can't, then I have to comply with the law. And that's kind of that's really the height of the model that he's talking about. And maybe what you do is you would, even before that moment, you might find ways to signal that you're that kind of a person, and so allow people who don't want to have that conversation just simply avoid it. And so that's sort of the notion.
Well, let me backtrack a minute then, because that does raise the potential for avoiding one of what I think is the most malevolent harms in denials of access to public accommodation, and that is the humiliation of being rejected and being told that you're not good enough and you're not like the other members of your community to be eligible for the services. So maybe there is something to that idea.
I don't know. It's interesting.
I think it's already legal.
Yeah, I do too, actually. I'm not sure.
I don't think there's any law against it. So I wrote that to Andy and I said, I'm not sure what it is you're proposing and why this is novel. I think you can already do it.
Yeah, and I think the problem is it wouldn't address the case that made it all the way to the Supreme Court. That would not have satisfied that baker in that case. I mean, but look, the great thing about this, I think, is that there's a whole new wave of scholarship, and Professor Koppelman is one of the leading voices in it. Professor Wilson, who texted our question, has been doing it for a while and is very important. People really trying to grapple with these questions and come up with approaches that keep from elevating these conflicts into constitutional questions that are going to go all the way up to Supreme Court. I'm not sure, that one might go all the way up to Supreme Court. But anyhow, yeah.
But how do we get along is the
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
Even though we
yeah.
fundamentally disagree.
Right. And I mean, your point is so important, Alexander. It would be so ironic if something that is a relatively minor issue affecting only a small number of business owners, and probably, you know, it's an issue that will go away in due course. It would be really bad if that case went back up to the Supreme Court. They dodged it one time to try to give us all an opportunity to do what we're talking about, and they practically spelled it out in neon letters in the majority opinion. You don't want us to constitutionalize this issue. Go often figuratively, and it would be the same Supreme Court, and then issue some constitutional decision that would be very difficult to cabin just to sexual orientation. It would change the whole structure of anti-discrimination law. It would open up all kinds of potentially, you know, pernicious questions that have been closed about race discrimination, other types of discrimination, that would just lead to a lot of conflict in our country. So, conversation much better than
lawsuits.
Lawsuits, yeah.
Let's send him to Colorado.
Yeah, let's send him to Colorado. That's a good suggestion.
Okay, we've got 1 minute, so I'll throw this out there, and any of you can weigh in as sort of a final note. And Kai Feldblum, who was a Georgetown law professor and former chair of the Federal Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, said, "The clash between gay rights and religious liberty is a zero-sum game. People who don't see that are fooling themselves." Is that right?
That does not sound like Professor Feldman at all. You sure that was?
That may have been an earlier comment.
You think she's evolved on that?
Yeah, I think she's evolved on that.
I think there's
So regardless of if she still thinks that, there are people, I think, who would say, at the end of the day, we can talk all we want, try and build bridges, but somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose here.
Well, look, but part of that comment is both overly dramatic and also stating something a little bit simple. And that is, rights are always in conflict. This happens all the time. I mean, you know, Chief Justice Durham spent a career dealing with conflicting rights. You have a right to free speech, but you don't have the right to libel somebody. You have a right to own your property, but you don't have a right to, you know, put your cement dust over the fence of your neighbor. So rights are always coming into conflict. And it's been the brilliance and genius of America that we figure out how to make it work, how to get along. And religious people are actually a pretty good model in this regard. Catholics think that Protestants are going to hell. The Protestants think the Catholics are going to hell. They all think the Jews are going to hell. They think that Mormons aren't Christians. They think, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And yet, despite centuries past where they would fight each other and even want to kill each other, we've all kind of figured out how to sit down and break bread together and be okay together. And if we can do that with some of these deep, fundamental questions about life and God and salvation and so forth, then assuredly we can figure out ways for religious people and LGBT people and religious LGBT people and LGBT religious people to get along. And that's my hope.
I want to again thank our three panelists and thank you all for your participation.
And before you all go, I want to invite the panel just to stick right where you are. We're just going to have a few concluding remarks, and then we hope there is a small choir prepared to sing 2 verses from God Be With You, but we'll see. But yeah, so I was scheduled to give the final remarks for today, very brief remarks, and then, oh, they're here, good. But then a friend of mine who is a therapist whose majority of her clientele is LGBT and LDS, wrote something recently in response to the devotional that President Nelson gave at BYU, last week, right? And I read it, and it felt like a revelation to me, and so I thought I could never say anything better than that, and I think it's a very good note on which to end the conversations that we've been having today. So I just want to introduce my friend, Laura Skaggs-Doohan.
That's what you get for being Kendall's friend. It's worth it. What makes a heart beat and what makes a heart stop? As a physician, that's what President Nelson shared learning about in his talk. Learning which eventually enabled him to perform successful open heart operations. He went on to share, the same can be said of the law of gravity and the laws of foil and lift that allow airplanes to fly. Each is an absolute truth. Doctors or pilots do not have the power to change those laws, but their understanding of them safeguards lives. As a mental health therapist, I too completed my graduate work with a focus on the heart, but in my case, on an aspect more specific and sometimes harder to see. What makes an LGBTQ heartbeat and what makes it stop? Or in other words, what makes an LGBTQ heart want to live and what makes an LGBTQ heart want to die? As I am tasked with safeguarding LGBTQ lives against suicide, learning the principles that govern positive mental health outcomes for LGBTQ people has been imperative. Presently, I work with suicidal LGBTQ Mormons on a daily basis, and I feel God with me in my work. President Nelson cites looking to research and new experimentation in his graduate years as the foundation of his learning. My graduate learning about the LGBTQ heart took a similar focus. A growing body of research indicated that sexual orientation had a biological origin, and that decades of trying to change people's orientation or gender identity via reparative therapies not only didn't work, it caused considerable harm. Research had also begun to point to the incredible power of family acceptance of their LGBTQ children. The LGBT youth in families who are highly rejected are more than 8 times as likely to try to take their own lives by the time they're young adults. And in families that are even moderately rejecting, having some negative reactions to their gay or transgender child, but also have some positive reaction, those young people are still nearly twice as likely to kill themselves. Perhaps one of the most moving studies I learned about was MRI brain scans of people falling in love. Whether someone falls in love with someone of the opposite gender or falls in love with someone of the same gender, the same parts of the brain bursting with dopamine light up. Recently, brain scans of transgender people have also shown their brains to be more similar to the gender identity they feel within themselves than their biological sex. Science is fantastically eye-opening, and these are all things we didn't know a generation ago. 2 studies specific to LGBTQ Mormons also had a significant impact on my learning. One found that LGBTQ Mormons who took a single celibate or mixed orientation marriage path frequently had poorer mental health than those who dated or were in a relationship with a same-sex partner. The most eye-opening part of the study, though, was this: the LGBTQ Mormons who were able to integrate and live into both their queer identities and their spiritual identities as Latter-day Saints had the best mental health outcomes of all. In the second study, a study that took place in the year following the implementation of the November 2015 policy, it was found that stunningly, 73.4% of LGBTQ Mormon participants had symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder in connection to their religious experiences. The same symptoms most often associated with soldiers returning from war, refugees fleeing persecution, or victims of escaping domestic violence or sexual assault were showing up in both post and practicing LGBTQ Mormons at a rate 10 times the general population. That was mind-blowing. In simplified summary, research was indicating that LGBTQ Mormons did best when they were able to healthily live into both their queer and religious identities at the same time. However, this outcome was quite rare, and instead, an astronomical number of LGBTQ Mormons and post-Mormons were suffering with symptoms of PTSD. What makes an LGBTQ heart beat and what makes it want to stop? As I sit with LGBTQ Mormons and post-Mormons whose hearts are suicidal as an outgrowth of spiritual trauma, they get better as they're able to shed the negative messages they've internalized about being LGBTQ from both religion and society. They get better when their families come to shed these negative ideas as well and embrace them with open arms. They get better when their agency on how to move forward in their life path is honored as sacred ground, and they are celebrated in communities that affirm their choices. They get better when they distance themselves from negative messages or rejecting spaces while they are still healing. They get better when their family members and friends speak up in their behalf when they're being put down, left out, or marginalized, no matter who the speaker is. They get better when their psychological trauma is treated with trauma-specific therapies. They get better when they're able to build life partnerships and families that have the same meaningful bonds that every human heart seeks to form and nurture. They get better when they know they can take this journey with their God, not being told or internalizing that they will be cut off from God if they do so. They get better when they're able to lay hold on every good thing, the part of them that is LGBTQ and the part of them that is spiritual, the part of them that wants to connect and the part of them that wants to contribute their many gifts. Like doctors and pilots, I didn't make up the principles that govern LGBTQ mental health. We've merely discovered them and now use them daily to safeguard lives. I pray with my feet every day that Latter-day Saints will come to fully understand these discoveries too. We are all part of one body in Christ. May we see that each part, however different, is equally needed by us. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, very much. I'd like to invite the choir to come on down right here in front of the stage. And I believe they're going to invite the rest of us to join in one of the verses, but I'll let Patrick tell us what's going to happen. And then we're going to put the lyrics up on the big screen. Once the choir concludes, that will be the end of our conference today. And I just want to thank everybody for participating, thank the panelists, the speakers, and all of you, and of course everybody at home who's been tuning in off and on throughout the day. Thank you very much.
Hello, we are a small sampling of some students from the University of Utah choral program, and we're honored to offer the closing hymn for this event. You are invited to sing the second and final verse with us today.